On Wednesday, 25th March 1992, at 12:14 p.m., workmate Stephen Dawson walked up the driveway of a small house on Parr Road in Papatoetoe, South Auckland. Susan Burdett, a 39-year-old accounts clerk, had not arrived at work that morning. She had not called. Her colleagues could not reach her by telephone. Dawson found the front door unlocked, the bedroom blinds drawn. Inside the main bedroom, Susan lay on her waterbed, her upper body covered by bedding, her legs hanging off the side, a wooden softball bat resting beside her. He did not touch her. He left immediately. Emergency services were called at 12:21 p.m. The first crime scene video, recorded by police that afternoon, documented what the pathologist would later confirm. Susan Burdett had been sexually assaulted and killed by multiple blows to the head. Decades would pass before the courts determined who was responsible. On Monday, 23rd March 1992, Susan Burdett followed a predictable routine. She finished her shift at Nuplex Industries, where she worked as an accounts clerk, returned to her Papatoetoe home, and later drove to Manukau Superstrike to bowl with her team. Witness statements and bowling alley records confirmed she was at the lanes that evening. She left sometime after 10 o'clock. Friends later described her to investigators as organized, cautious, and private, a woman who lived alone and kept a softball bat beside her bed as a precaution. She liked to feel safe, one teammate told police. The next day, Tuesday, 24th March, Susan did not arrive at work. Her colleagues noticed immediately because of her usual reliability. That contrast, a careful woman with a stable routine, shaped early assumptions about victimology and risk. By the end of that Monday evening, the softball bat was simply part of her domestic life, an object she kept just in case. By late morning on Wednesday, 25th of March, concern at Susan's workplace had become formal. No one had heard from her since Monday night. Stephen Dawson drove to Parr Road shortly before noon. His later court testimony described what he found: an unlocked front door, curtains drawn in the bedroom, and Susan lying on the bed with a duvet over her upper body. Blood was visible on the bedding. The softball bat lay beside her. Dawson backed out of the house without touching anything and called for help. The first officers on scene secured the premises and initiated homicide protocols. Detective Senior Sergeant Michelle Burke became the officer in charge. A police video camera documented the scene that afternoon: blood-soaked sheets, evident head trauma, the bat positioned on the bed. The pathologist's report, completed days later, established cause of death as blunt force trauma, at least 5 blows to the head, with a blunt object consistent with the wooden bat. In early 1992, the county's Manukau policing district was already investigating a series of unsolved home invasion rapes across South and Central Auckland. The pattern involved nighttime entries into women's homes, threats of violence, blindfolding, and sexual assault. At the time of Susan's death, those cases had not been connected to her murder. Her killing stood alone, a homicide in a residential street with no clear suspect, no signs of forced entry, and no obvious burglary motive. Forensic practice in 1992 meant semen recovered from vaginal swabs was preserved and blood typed, but the DNA database tools that would later prove decisive did not yet exist. The semen profile was stored. The identity of the contributor remained unknown. Investigators focused on immediate leads: neighbors, acquaintances, prior calls to the address, any sign of burglary reports nearby. The softball bat was logged as the weapon. The semen sample was treated as forensic potential, awaiting technology that had not yet arrived. In the weeks after 25th March 1992, detectives reconstructed Susan's movements through witness interviews, phone records, and bowling alley documentation. They confirmed she left Manukau Superstrike on the night of 23rd of March and returned to her Papatoetoe home. There was no evidence she left the house again. Initial theories included a targeted sexual attack by a stranger, an associate-related offense, or a burglary interrupted. There were no signs of ransacking typical of theft, though some drawers showed disturbance. The forensic pathologist confirmed blunt force trauma as the cause of death. A forensic scientist documented semen in the vaginal swabs. Blood grouping indicated a contributor other than Susan. An incident room handled dozens of lines of enquiry. Lead sheets later produced in court show house-to-house canvasses, background checks on former partners, and analysis of prior calls to Parr Road. None produced an immediate suspect. The homicide investigation remained a live file, but with no named offender, progress slowed through the remainder of 1992. On 18th of March 1993, 17-year-old Taina Pora was interviewed at a South Auckland police station regarding a stolen vehicle. During that interview, he asked officers whether anyone had been caught for the murder of Susan Burdett, then claimed he knew who was responsible. Over the next 4 days, he participated in extended interviews without a lawyer present, giving varying accounts that gradually placed him at the scene. Transcripts reproduced in later court proceedings show Pora initially describing knowledge of the crime, then shifting to claim he was present during a burglary involving other men, and finally stating he participated in the rape and murder. He was taken to Parr Road to identify Susan's house, but was unable to pick it out accurately. A blood sample excluded Pora as the source of the semen found in Susan's body. Despite that, and despite the absence of physical evidence placing him inside the house, he was charged with rape and murder. In May 1994, a jury convicted him on both counts. Between 1987 and 1996, a series of home invasion rapes in Auckland was investigated as the work of a single serial offender. Victims consistently described a man entering at night, threatening them, blindfolding them, covering their upper bodies with bedding, and positioning them on a bed with their legs hanging off the side before sexual assault. On 13th of May 1996, police arrested Malcolm Rewa at his home in Mangere. Subsequent proceedings established him as responsible for at least 24 rapes over a 9-year period. In 1998, he received preventive detention with a minimum non-parole period of 22 years for those offences. Forensic comparison showed that DNA from Susan Burdett's case matched Rewa's profile. He was charged with her rape and murder and tried in the High Court at Auckland in 1998. The jury convicted Rewa of multiple rapes, but could not agree on Susan's murder. At a second trial later that year, he was convicted of raping Susan, but again, the jury could not reach a verdict on the murder charge. Following the second hung jury on the murder charge in 1998, the Solicitor General entered a stay of proceedings, effectively halting further prosecution of Malcolm Rewa for Susan Burdett's murder, except in special circumstances. Meanwhile, in 1999, the Court of Appeal quashed Taina Pora's original 1994 convictions after Rewa's rape conviction came to light, ordering a retrial. In March 2000, however, a second jury again convicted Pora of rape and murder, with the Crown continuing to argue he was involved alongside Rewa. By the early 2000s, the official record held contradictory outcomes. Susan was raped by Rewa, as proven by DNA. She was murdered by someone, with Pora convicted twice as a participant. Rewa had twice faced juries on the murder charge, with no verdict reached. The softball bat remained in the exhibits list as the confirmed weapon. The semen profile, now firmly linked to Rewa, underscored his presence, but the system had reached a legally stable, yet logically contested configuration. From the late 2000s, former police officer turned private investigator Tim McKinnell undertook a sustained review of Tena Pora's case, working with lawyers and medical experts to reassess the reliability of his confession. McKinnell spent years gathering documentation, interviewing witnesses, and compiling evidence that had not been presented at either of Pora's trials. He examined the original police interview transcripts line by line, noting the inconsistencies and the ways in which Pora's account shifted in response to interviewer prompts. Expert opinions obtained for subsequent appeals concluded that Pora had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, a condition caused by prenatal alcohol exposure that affects cognitive function, impulse control, and decision-making. Assessments indicated he likely functioned with a mental age significantly below his chronological age at the time of the police interviews. Combined with the length and nature of questioning, conducted over 4 days without legal representation, and the inducement of a substantial reward for information about the Burdett case, this raised serious concerns about the reliability of his statements. Psychologists noted that individuals with Pora's cognitive profile are particularly susceptible to suggestion and eager to please authority figures, often telling interrogators what they believe the interrogators want to hear. The case eventually reached the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in London, then New Zealand's highest appellate body. In March 2015, the Privy Council quashed Pora's convictions, holding that the combination of his personal vulnerabilities and the unlikelihood that a meticulous serial offender who raped Susan would have acted alongside a novice teenager made the verdicts unsafe. The confession was unreliable, the judgment stated plainly. The New Zealand government subsequently awarded Pora more than $3.5 million in compensation in 2017, formally acknowledging the miscarriage of justice. The homicide file on Susan Burdett reverted to a position closer to 1992, one confirmed offender for rape and an unresolved question of who killed her. Following the Privy Council decision, New Zealand Police asked the Solicitor General to review the 1998 stay of proceedings against Malcolm Rewa. The exoneration of Tena Pora constituted the special circumstances required to reopen the case, the very threshold that had been set 2 decades earlier. In 2017, the High Court lifted the stay, clearing the way for a third trial of Malcolm Rewa for Susan Burdett's murder, nearly 25 years after her death. The decision meant that investigators would need to prepare the case anew, with exhibits that had been in storage for a quarter of a century. Police reopened the case file, re-examined the preserved evidence, including the softball bat, the blood-stained bedding, and the semen samples that had been maintained in controlled conditions since 1992. Forensic scientists confirmed that the biological evidence remained viable for testing and court presentation. Investigators prepared updated briefs of evidence, incorporating advances in forensic science and the pattern evidence that had emerged from Rewa's other prosecuted offences. This pattern evidence was crucial. It documented a distinctive method across his confirmed rapes: nighttime entry into women's homes through unlocked doors or windows, threats of violence to ensure compliance, blindfolding victims with items found in the home, covering their upper bodies with bedding, positioning them on beds with their legs hanging off the side, sexual assault, and post-offence, rummaging through the premises for valuables. Crown prosecutors compiled testimony from multiple survivors who were willing to describe their ordeals in open court, knowing their accounts would be used to establish that the man who raped Susan Burdett was the same man who had attacked them. In February 2019, Rewa's third trial began in the High Court at Auckland before Justice Venning. The Crown alleged that he entered Susan's Papatoetoe home on the night of 23rd March 1992, raped her, and murdered her with the softball bat she kept for protection, killing her to eliminate a witness who could identify him. The defense maintained that Rewa and Susan had a consensual sexual relationship conducted in secret, and that someone else killed her. after he had departed. For the first time, the jury would consider the murder charge without the complication of a parallel conviction against another man. At the 2019 trial, jurors heard testimony spanning weeks from forensic experts, former investigators, and multiple prior victims of Malcolm Rewa. The Crown called survivor after survivor. Their accounts admitted under evidence law provisions, allowing proof of a distinctive pattern or modus operandi. One after another, women described assaults in their own homes in which he had blindfolded and gagged them, covered their upper bodies with blankets or sheets, positioned them on beds with their legs hanging off the side, and raped them, often at night while other family members slept unaware in nearby rooms. Several described how he had threatened them with violence if they made any sound, and how he had rifled through their belongings afterward. The similarities were striking in their consistency across cases spanning nearly a decade of offending. Crime scene photographs from Parr Road and the 1992 police video, played for the jury, showed Susan's body positioned in precisely this manner. On her waterbed, upper body covered by the duvet, legs hanging off the side, naked from the waist down, with the softball bat resting on the bed beside her head. The Crown argued this configuration matched Rewa's established pattern exactly and was wholly inconsistent with his claim of consensual sex at another location, followed by Susan returning home alone and being killed by someone else. A forensic scientist provided crucial testimony regarding the clothing evidence. Semen matching Rewa's DNA profile was found inside Susan's body, but not on the clothing she had worn to bowling that Monday night: her jeans, underwear, and top. Those clothes were found neatly folded in a laundry basket in the house, showing no traces of semen or sexual activity. If she had dressed and gone out after sexual intercourse, the expert explained carefully to the jury, we would expect to find semen traces on her underwear or outer garments. We found none. This suggested she had undressed before the sexual activity, not after, consistent with an attack in her home, not a consensual encounter elsewhere. Rewa exercised his right to take the stand in his own defense. He repeated his assertion of a secret relationship with Susan, providing details of alleged assignations which the Crown systematically challenged as inconsistent with his earlier statements to police and with documentary records. Prosecutors highlighted discrepancies regarding a distinctive truck he claimed to have driven to meet Susan. The timing of when he owned the vehicle did not align with his account. On 22 February 2019, after approximately 2 weeks of evidence and relatively brief deliberation, the jury returned their verdict: guilty of the murder of Susan Burdett. On 26 March 2019, almost exactly 27 years after Susan Burdett's body was discovered, Justice Geoffrey Venning delivered his sentencing remarks in the High Court at Auckland. He sentenced Malcolm Rewa to life imprisonment with a minimum and non-parole period of 12 years for Susan's murder, to be served concurrently with his existing sentences for the serial rapes that had already resulted in preventive detention. In his remarks, the judge addressed the brutality of the attack directly, noting that Susan had been beaten to death with her own protective implement while alone in her home at night. He spoke of the profound, lasting impact on Susan's family, who had waited more than a quarter of a century for this outcome, attending multiple trials across decades. Their grief renewed each time the case returned to court. Justice Venning also acknowledged the extraordinary procedural history that preceded this sentencing, explicitly referencing the wrongful imprisonment of Tena Pora as a significant element of the case's legacy. Public reporting from outside the courthouse that day recorded statements from Susan's family members. Her sister told media that the family could finally begin to find some measure of closure, though nothing could ever restore what had been taken from them. They had lost Susan, and then endured decades of legal proceedings that seemed, at times, to lead nowhere. Teina Pora, now in his mid-40s, attended the sentencing hearing himself. He had spent 21 years in prison for crimes he did not commit, arrested at 17, released in his late 30s. Speaking to journalists afterward, he commented on the significance of the verdict in finally, publicly confirming that he had been imprisoned for a crime committed by another man entirely. "I always knew I didn't do it," he said simply. "Now everyone else knows too." With sentencing complete, the prosecution phase of Susan Burdett's case formally ended. However, appellate avenues remained open to Malcolm Rewa under New Zealand law, and the stability of the outcome would depend on whether subsequent judicial review upheld the conviction. Following his conviction, Malcolm Rewa lodged an appeal with the Court of Appeal of New Zealand, arguing on multiple grounds that his trial had been fundamentally unfair. His legal team contended the trial counsel had provided ineffective representation, failing to adequately challenge certain aspects of the Crown's case. They further argued that significant categories of evidence, particularly the pattern evidence from prior victims describing Rewa's modus operandi, had been improperly admitted and was unduly prejudicial, effectively inviting the jury to convict based on his character as a serial rapist rather than on evidence specific to Susan Burdett's murder. The appeal process required comprehensive review of trial transcripts, evidence rulings, and judicial directions to the jury. In February 2023, the Court of Appeal dismissed the appeal in its entirety, finding no miscarriage of justice had occurred. The judges concluded in their written decision that the trial had been conducted fairly, that the pattern evidence was properly admitted under established legal principles regarding proof of identity and modus operandi, and that the jury's verdict was sound and supported by the evidence. Rewa then sought leave to appeal to the Supreme Court of New Zealand, the final avenue of appeal available within the domestic judicial system. This required demonstrating that there was an appearance of a miscarriage of justice sufficient to warrant the court's intervention. In April 2024, the Supreme Court issued a decision refusing leave. The court concluded there was no appearance of a risk of miscarriage of justice that would justify further appellate review. The published reasons noted the prior history of trials, acknowledged the thoroughness of the 2019 proceedings, and confirmed that the jury's verdict would stand. By that point, more than 32 years had passed since Susan Burdett's death on Parr Road in Papatoetoe. The combination of the Privy Council's 2015 decision exonerating Pora, the 2017 lifting of the stay, the 2019 conviction, and the 2023-2024 appellate rulings produced a legally settled position at last. Teina Pora exonerated and compensated for his wrongful imprisonment. Malcolm Rewa convicted of both the rape and murder of Susan Burdett. The Supreme Court's refusal of leave effectively closed criminal litigation in New Zealand courts regarding her killing. What remained were the records themselves and the exhibits still held in police storage. The softball bat Susan Burdett kept beside her bed enters the documentation. First as a domestic precaution, described by friends and colleagues who noted she liked to feel safe living alone in her Papatoetoe home. She was a careful woman, they said, organized and security conscious, and the bat by the bed was part of that caution. The object appears again in the crime scene inventory on 25 March 1992, logged formally as an exhibit. Wooden bat, apparent weapon, blood visible on surface. Across court transcripts spanning 3 decades and multiple trials, the bat recurs as a fixed point in shifting legal narratives. It appears in the pathologist's clinical description of the injuries to Susan's skull, wounds consistent with repeated blows from a blunt wooden object. It features in detectives' evidence about its precise position on the bed beside Susan's body, resting there as if placed rather than dropped. It anchors closing addresses in which prosecutors argued that the bat's presence demonstrated an offender's intent to silence a witness capable of identifying him. In the Privy Council's 2015 decision on Tena Pora, the bat is mentioned as part of the crime scene that his confession had failed to accurately describe, one of many documented details that undermined the reliability of statements made by a cognitively impaired teenager over 4 days of police questioning. In later appellate rulings on Rewa, the bat features less prominently, one exhibit among many in a now dense evidential record stretching across decades of legal proceedings. Today, the bat remains an exhibit held by New Zealand police, a physical object attached to a reference number, stored in an evidence facility alongside the bedding from Susan's waterbed. The crime scene photographs shot by police cameras on that March afternoon, and the preserved biological samples that ultimately linked Malcolm Rewa to the crime. Somewhere on a shelf, there sits a labelled evidence bag containing the wooden softball bat that began as Susan Burdett's protection against the fears of a woman living alone, became the weapon used by an intruder to end her life, and now rests as a fixed artifact in a closed case file. The same object, understood differently at each stage of an investigation that took 32 years to reach its conclusion.